What are the threats to America's agricultural productivity and ultimately our food supply? Are there any? Yes, there are. We're digging into those threats in this very special episode of the Business of Agriculture. Before we hop into this awesome topic, I want to tell you about my friends over at AgView Solutions. AgView Solutions specializes in helping farmers with transition planning, cost of production, strategic growth, biz opportunity analysis, and just overall improvements to your farm or agribusiness's bottom line, acting as an advisor. The team at AgView Solutions is comprised of consultants who also farm and run multiple businesses. They get it. Check out their service at agviewsolutions.com. They help farms in 25 states as well as Canada. They even do workshops that are tailored for ag businesses. You can find out more at agviewsolutions.com. That's agviewsolutions.com. Hey there, welcome to another fantastic episode of the Business of Agriculture. It's a solo cast, just me on this one, with a topic I've been rolling around in my head now for quite a while, but ultimately it's coming to a head here in the last few weeks. As you know, it's winter season. I do a lot of speaking at agricultural meetings all over North America. Been around ag folks, been around some non-ag folks. Took some questions at one of these most recent speaking engagements I did, and a person came up with a question that said, you know, we're in the genetics business and we think a lot about what we can do to keep producing, et cetera, but what about the role of climate? And if there is climate change, is it going to be detrimental to our ability to continue to produce food crops? Absolutely not. I'm not a climate crusader, and I'll get into that. But because of that question, started going down the road of what really are the threats to our productive capacity. You know, if you keep up with my show, you see my stuff on social media, I talk a lot about our amazing productive capacity. In fact, it's put us into this surplus category, and we're there globally. We've got amazing amounts of food crops, and now so many crops that we're using even for biofuels, things like corn and soybeans, etc., that are going into the gas tank now because we had to create demand for them because of our massive ability to supply. So we're going to dig into what are the actual possible threats that could change our ability to make these massive amounts of food crops. Is there an actual threat of that? And I gotta be honest with you, almost all of them, in fact, pretty much all of them, are political. All of the threats to our ability to make food here in the United States and most of the civilized world where we're good at making food come down to threat of some sort of geopolitical or national or local political regulation that can impact our ability to grow food. So I've got a number of Asians in agriculture. If you keep up with my stuff, you know I talk about the Asians of agriculture: regulation, confrontation, escalation, weaponization, and collectivization. Those are the things that I see are threats to the food supply or our ability to make food, if you will. I'm going to get into all those, but let's talk about what we think the risk is. You know, our genetics companies are out here always trying to produce better genes, better bags of seed, and the reality is the seed's better than us. You know, we've got, and my friend like Kelly Garrett and my extreme ag guys say, hell, we've got genetics that can make 400, 500 bushel corn, and the reason we're not doing it is because of us or because of weather, and it's not because of a lack of genetics. Okay, let's talk about weather, because that's the one that a lot of times comes up. I have my non-ag friends, oh man, I heard the crops are going to be really, really bad. Reality, even when we sing that and cry wolf a little bit, the crops aren't that bad. We've had a terrible dry year at my farm in Indiana, for instance. By the end of July, we didn't get any rain again until October. We still absolutely rang the bell on yield. Let's just talk about the threat of weather and why it is actually become somewhat mitigated. Does weather control crops? We know that. We got that. Yes. But to a way lesser extent than it did just a few years ago, and certainly 100 years ago. Give you a couple of historicals. 90 years ago, 1935, the Dust Bowl. Terrible drought conditions throughout much of the United States of America. You've seen the pictures, the images, based on our farming technology and our ability to do things differently now. We don't till like we used to, thank God, although we still till too much. But what do? We had these terrible drought conditions in the soil. You know, several states blew eastward in the Dust Bowl. We grew about 35 bushels of corn. Now, last year, we knocked out 186 and a half bushels, I think is the number. So we're 5.5 times our productive capacity. Why? Hybridization. You've heard me talk about these things. In other words, a drought doesn't kill us. Let's go to 1988, year I graduated from high school. Terrible drought year. We lost about 2/3 of productive capacity with our broadacre crops. 2012, the next big drought year, we lost about 1/3. What changed? Was the drought 1/3 worse in 88 than it was in 2012? Not really. The difference is we continue to get better with our farming practices and our products and our genetics. In other words, we're not insulated from weather by any means, but we are more insulated than we used to be because of our ability to respond. So do I believe that weather or climate change or any of these sort of things are going to make it so that we can't produce food? No, I do not believe that. There are isolated instances, of course. You see this, and depending on which media you choose, and much of the media is obviously crisis peddling. I just shot a video about that. We can please stop with this whole crisis thing that somehow we're going to starve. And that's when I started going down this road of what really are the threats to America's productive capacity, or even global productive capacity to grow crops. I'm going to tell you that weather certainly always looms, but to a way lesser extent than it did when we were more primitive. We have better genetics. We have better farming practices. We have the ability to use new products and inputs that actually reduce stress on the crops. We are more, I use the word insulated, let's just say protected from big weather scares. The other part of this is it is uncommon that we have a weather scare that is global. Now, this does mean that we need still to have free trade or some level of globalization. In other words, if the United States lays an egg on food production because of weather, we hope that we still have some relationship with other countries in the world where we can buy our commodities from them, and vice versa. When they have a weather scare, they can buy from us. But even in a country this size, the United States, it's unusual that weather is devastating from Pacific to Atlantic, from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico, or Gulf of America, as you might call it. It's unusual that we have that widespread of a weather event. Okay, so there we go. Is there a weather condition? Absolutely. But is that the big threat? No. Okay. War. War is, again, on the geopolitical front, and that is a threat. Okay, that's why I talked about confrontation. On the confrontation, is war a threat to global food supply or here in the United States of America? Well, there hasn't been a war on the United States soil since the 1800s, so that's a good thing. So in other words, are we going to have the Chinese invading Iowa? Well, God knows we hope not. And we're going to have a hell of a lot of problems if that should ever happen that are going to be way beyond whether or not we can grow corn for the ethanol plant. We're going to have a lot of issues. So confrontation is a definite threat to our productive capacity. There's no question, right? But let's put it in a global scale. 3 years now? We're 3 years in on the Russia invasion of Ukraine. And we wondered if when Russia invaded Ukraine, we're going to see this skyrocketing of commodity prices. And we learned, and if you didn't already know, that Ukraine produces a lot of sunflowers that go to sunflower oil. They produce a lot of corn, a lot of wheat. And a lot of that goes to the African countries, the Middle Eastern countries, if you will, that are on the north side of Africa, and then the Middle East, the traditional Middle East, as you know, where we get oil and where there's always a war going on. But this war in Ukraine and Russia didn't really rally global prices that much. It was a little bit of a rally, and I'm not a markets guy, as you well know, but it didn't actually shake the whole foundations. It turns out that as big as Ukraine is, it's not so significant that it changed global supply that much by taking a bunch of those acres out of production. Also, then the shipping ability, etc., that was the bigger thing. It was more about the transportation and Russia putting mines out in the ocean that caused more grief than the actual loss of productive capacity. So can confrontation change the availability of food in the world? Yes. Would it have to be a world war level event? Yes, it would, because right now, isolated incidences in places like the Ukraine just aren't big enough to really dent this massive supply of commodity crops. Now, no, I'm not talking about specialty crop right now. If you had a war that knocked out Florida, obviously, and Southern California and Arizona and Texas, then, yeah, lettuce and tomatoes and all sorts of specialty crops would be at harm. But big broadacre stuff, you've got wheat that's grown on every continent with the exception of Antarctica. You've got so much massive amounts of supply. The United States produced 17 billion acres of bushels, 17 billion bushels of corn in 2025. That's 70% more corn than we made just 25 years ago in the year 2000. You're talking about an awful lot of stuff. So war would have to be at a devastating global level to really impact our food productive capacity and our food supply. So confrontation, yes. It's probably a bigger risk when you start thinking about distribution, as we saw with the Ukraine-Russia situation, the Black Sea, and then even now the Mediterranean with the whatever country it is, I can't remember which one it is, that's causing grief with shipping through there. And you've got always the Suez Canal, and then there's a potential fight between the United States and China right now over who actually economically controls the Panama Canal. So usually confrontation recently, and I'm not talking historically, but in the last decade or two, any confrontation has usually impacted distribution. Use another Asian word, transportation, if you will, more than the actual production. So do I see confrontation as being a threat? Yeah. A geopolitical threat? Yes. But mostly then it shuts down shipping lanes. All of a sudden we're doing things like embargoing. Look what we're doing with oil in Venezuela, etc. So imagine if that was wheat from Russia instead of oil from Venezuela, that the United States, as a weaponization, if you will, was restricting food shipments or blockading shipments of wheat or what have you. That could be an issue. So while we're on the subject of confrontation, I want to get into the weaponization, which I see actually being a bigger potential threat, especially to us here in the United States of America. Before I do that, I want to remind you about my friends at Title Grow. Title Grow. I'm talking about all these Asian words here that I'm using. Things like I said, regulation, confrontation, weaponization, collectivization as threats to the food productive capacity here in the United States of America. But let's talk about the Asian of frustration. If you are a producer of agricultural goods, you know about frustration of paying for inputs that don't give you a payback. But you can right the ship by using these goods from these inputs from Title Grow. If you're looking for cutting-edge bio-based solutions that deliver measurable yield performance, you need to know about Title Grow Agri-Science. Title Grow utilizes upcycled seafood byproducts to precisely formulate powerful plant nutrition and crop protection chemistry. You heard that right. It's seafood byproducts. It's not seaweed. It's seafood byproducts. Real science powered by nature, built to positively impact your bottom line. These products do not require you to change anything. They fit right in with the existing crop inputs and the fertilizer programs you are using. Your crop protection can stay the same. It's about getting more and less frustration, more out of what you spend your money on and less frustration. You can visit TitleGrowAg.com to learn more. That's title, as in a big wave of water. Title, Tidal, grow like what your kids do, ag, TitleGrowAg.com. Check it out and tell them Damian sent you. Okay, so on the issue of confrontation, and we've seen that again, these shocks to the system haven't been all that we were worried about. Again, things like the war in Ukraine is the best example, in very agricultural area, and it really didn't change the food availability or the global surplus much at all. But let's talk about weaponization. And where I'm talking about is, look at what our adversary is. And this is a problem that we have in agriculture. We still believe that if we can just sell a few more soybeans to China, everything's going to be great. We're going to have $15 soybeans again here in the United States and everything's hunky-dory. I've said this a number of times. You go back to my episodes. China does not want to be our customer. They want to be our replacement, militarily and economically. We are 1/4 of the globe's economy, at 26% of the globe's economy right here in terms of our money. And China's number 2 with about 16% of the global economy. They want to replace us. They do not want to buy stuff from us long term. They are going to use us as a dumping ground for their cheap shit that we put on our store shelves at Walmart. But you know what? They don't want to keep buying our stuff. Now, here's the other part that I said they want to be our replacement economically and also militarily. So let's just say you are the number 2. Let's just say you keep rattling let's say you finally decide you're tired of playing ball with the United States. And it could be about Trump or it could be about whatever the issue is. But really, let's talk about their long-term plan. They began their Belt and Road Initiative, investing billions and billions of dollars in the developing world to extract resources from those countries, places like Brazil, the continent of Africa, for God's sakes. They began doing this. Big port on the western side of South America, the biggest port in the world right now, I believe it is, in Ecuador or Peru. This is what I'm talking about. This country, China, had plans to work around us going clear back to 2013. So it's not about any particular president. This has been their long-term agenda. So what am I talking about when I say weaponization is a threat to our food productive capacity? Possibly. And no, I'm not a doomsdayer. Remember, I recorded a video and said, let's get past this crisis peddling. That's why I don't like the whole thing of, global warming is going to make us we can't grow food. None of that's true, okay? I heard we're all starving, we're overpopulated, all of these things. So that's why after I came up with this whole thing that we hear too much crisis from the mainstream media to even here in agriculture. We're all going to starve. You take away glyphosate from us, we're never going to be able to produce crops. No, that's not true. Okay, we took away antibiotics from pork production. We didn't take them away. We just made it much more judicious usage of those products. And what did we get? We still got all kinds of pork. And that's why pork is so abundant right now. It's almost at break even on the producers. Okay, so let's stop crying wolf and let's talk about really what might be threats to our food supply. And again, it's not about taking away glyphosate from us, although I'm going to get into regulation. But I really believe one thing that confrontation and weaponization. What if China, who arguably released a virus on the world that was produced in a lab? You can call me a conspiracy person all you want, but if you really believe that COVID came from some dude eating the head off of a bat like Ozzy Osbourne at a damn wet market in some town in China, you're maybe not thinking through this. Why am I talking about this potential? What if China wants to do harm to their adversary that they want to replace, meaning the United States of America? And what if they realize that our abundance is one of our strengths? We have national security through abundant agricultural productivity. How do you shatter some of that confidence? How do you rattle the biggest economy in the world? How do you do that? Well, let's start with their food supply. Do you remember a year or two ago when 3 Chinese nationals in the Detroit airport were detained? It turns out they were trying to smuggle in fusarium, a crop disease. So imagine that the country that gave us the Asian carp, which is destroying the Great Lakes ecosystem, that gave us the emerald ash borer, and I can speak from personal experience, it has destroyed every ash tree, killed every ash tree in Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan because it came over on pallets from China. So the country that destroyed the Great Lakes ecosystem, that's taken away all of Damian's ash trees, 65 acres, not one ash tree that's ever going to become a timber log because the damn emerald ash borer insect that China gave us. So that gave us COVID. Are you not... That also had 3 of their nationals, 3 Chinese citizens arrested and detained in Detroit for bringing in a crop disease. You think it's beyond consideration that one of our threats to our food supply might be China introducing a toxin or a disease or a fungus into our fields so that we have a decrease in our crops, which all of a sudden means that we're spending more on our food and it creates havoc and also it rattles the psyche. It's like sabotage. That's how sabotage works, right? Right now, China is actively working against us as a saboteur country. When we have things like viruses that mess up your computer, or that you can't log on and do work, or that maybe there's an energy problem, you don't think that there's somehow an evil actor? Yeah, there's problems that just happen, right? But countries that want to do harm to us sometimes are working behind the scenes. And maybe you don't completely hear it that that's happening that way because they don't want to create a panic or hysteria. But I would see weaponization of disease. African swine fever, fusarium, go on down the list about what an adversary country might attempt to do. So do I believe there are threats to the food productive capacity of the United States? Yes. I think that insects and weather are probably not the biggest concern, but it could be something that is done to us by an adversarial country. Weaponization is, I think, one of our bigger concerns about our productive capacity. Let's go with regulation. Regulation. Let's look at the European Union. European Union, obviously, people love the idea of Europe. Oh, they ride around trains and everybody's happy and they take 3-hour lunches and take naps every day. And then that's all a neat idea. But there's some real dark underbelly to what happens in Europe also. Let's talk about the regulatory environment. Essentially, Europe and the European Union, the 27 countries that make up the European Union, offshored their environmental damage. While Brazil continues to add acres and do what they will in Brazil, becoming this mega agricultural producer, they're doing so to replace what was done in Europe. So Europe can feel good. They can drive around and maybe have a farmer out there with 3 cows in the hills in Switzerland with a cowbell on their neck, and they can say, oh, yes, that's traditional. It's amazing. See, this is what Swiss farmers do. They're out here in the hills wearing their knickers and their 3 cows. Well, that's neat for a postcard, and the people that are on vacation from New York might think that that's really pretty, but that's bullshit because it's not really where their food comes from. It's a postcard. It's a tourist picture, but it's not reality. Their beef comes from, well, outside of the European Union in many cases. So Regulation makes these things happen. It was the European Union that stated a big stated objective was to get to where they had 25 and then I think ultimately 50% of their farmed acres they wanted to be organic. So we know that organic food production reduces supply. You are not as productive on a per acre basis in organic production as you are in conventional. So regulation or overzealous amounts of regulation are, I believe, one of the other threats to our productive capacity. Well-intended, well-meaning folks that line up at the ballot box say, oh, that's great. All acres should be organic. Well, that's cool. But guess what? It's not going to be enough. So if you want to reduce supply, then yeah, legislate organic. So legislation and regulation are a threat to our food supply. Do I believe that taking away glyphosate is going to make it so we can't grow food? Probably not. We've been using this stuff now for what? More than 30 years with Roundup Ready beans being the first one, 1996, I believe it was. So we could probably, and it doesn't work as well as it did, and there's all kinds of stuff like that. So I'm not worried about little levels of regulation. I do see regulation coming to the United States of America. I've got an episode about this, of the Business of Agriculture, where I'll be talking to Zach Smith about this very thing, regulation of our water and what we discharge. We put a boatload of nutrients out there on the ground, and a lot of it doesn't get absorbed by the plant. It gets leached, it gets run off, washed, it gets volatilized. The point is, we're going to see regulation on our nutrient application. And it's probably due. Will it impact our food supply? Most likely in the short term, meaning when we have to make the adaptation for the first season or two, and then we'll get good at it. I can use the example of tetracycline that was in water drips in all the poultry barns in America 50 years ago because we learned that this antibiotic makes the chickens healthier. You can stick more in there in these confinement barns. They don't get all these diseases and these bacteria, so you just use this. And then, of course, what we had antibiotic resistant bugs, and then from that we said, let's take the tetracycline out of the poultry drips, and everybody said, oh my God, we're never going to be able to raise chickens, they're all going to die. And after a few months or a year, we adapted just fine, and we're growing more chickens, bigger chickens, healthier chickens than we ever did in a faster amount of time through genetics and through improved practices. So the regulation I'm talking about isn't like maybe taking away one of our products. But what if it's regulation, and I'm seeing some of this. RFK Jr. talks about we need more small family farms. Is it regulation that's going to then dictate farm size? There would be some sentiment for that. I got these people on Twitter are all wound up because I happened to put a video out, or a statement out there and said RFK Jr. says there's not enough farmers. Well, how many farmers do we need? That's kind of an arbitrary emotional statement. What's the right number? I think we have enough farmers. Clearly, we've got a surplus of just about everything. Well, people got really pissed off about that. So does that mean that if there is a proposal for a regulation on how big your farm can be, that it would get backing from our own agricultural community? Maybe. You know what would happen then also? What we know is commodity production favors size and scale. So if you see a regulation on what farm size can be, you might very well then see a decline in output on a per acre or per unit basis. What about regulation of the nutrients? Not only saying you've got to have a nutrient plan because we're getting too many nitrates in the water, but what about saying you've got to decrease your nitrogen application by 2/3? All of a sudden, we can't just recreationally till. We can't just recreationally fling fertilizer out there because all of a sudden we're limited on how we can use it. We got to maximize it. I see this day coming, by the way. Will it change yields? I think it will in the short term, but I think we'll adapt. What about regulation on what you can grow? Would that be a threat to our food supply? Absolutely it would. What about regulation of water? And I do see this being an issue. Ideally, the economics of it would work out. Why are we growing corn that's only worth $4.30 a bushel in an area that requires massive amounts of irrigation? You got to run the diesel or have an electric bill to pump all that out there. You're in an area that only gets 9 inches of rain, called the Panhandle of Texas, or western Kansas, or what have you. Areas that we're not historically producing certain crops. So the regulation could end up coming and saying, I'm in Phoenix. I'm sitting in my Arizona house right now in my office. Well, 60 miles down the road, there's dairy farms, and those dairy farms use a lot of water, and those dairy farms use a lot of water to grow silage and alfalfa in the desert. So we got 9.6 million dairy cows. Do we need 300,000 of them or 250,000 of them to be here in Arizona where we are already pushed for water? And also you got 4.5 million humans in the Phoenix Metroplex that say, can't we just truck our cheese in from Wisconsin and not grow the stuff here because I need water to fill my swimming pool? Regulation will go with the votes. Regulation will go with the humans and the population. And guess what, agriculture? You're completely outnumbered. So I see regulation of things like water, water usage, water quantity, in many places that are growing stuff that are going to be restricted through a regulatory environment. I see nutrient application being restricted. It could change yields. I see the thing that concerns me most is regulation of size, regulation of style. We have that, CAFOs, et cetera. You're not allowed to be a certain size. That could be a threat. Do I see regulation that puts farms out of business? Maybe. When food is abundant and priorities change, all of a sudden nobody thinks of these things as threats. I worked in a factory when I was in college. It's no longer in business in LaGrow, Indiana, because price of labor is a bit more, OSHA, EPA. Those are all costs of regulation that changed the ability for us to make stuff here in the United States. Could that come to agriculture? Yes, I believe it will. I believe it come in water and environmental are going to be your two big ones right there. What is going to change food supply inherently? I've got a couple more here. The biggest one I have is collectivization. By the way, before I get into that, I want to tell you about my friends over at Nano Yield. If you're looking for a real edge this season, take a look at Nano Yield products like Nano Pro. These patented mineral-based nanoparticles go in the tank at just 4 ounces per acre and act as a delivery system for your entire tank mix. Whether you're trying to improve your weed control or boost your fungicide performance or get more out of your nutrients that you already paid for, Nano Yield technology is an easy and affordable way to protect your investment and drive your return on your investment. Once growers see it work in the field, they do not spray without. You're talking about 4 ounces you dump in your spray tank. Let's say you make 3 passes every year, put it in there. It's going to make your stuff more effective. It makes your stuff work better. All right. You insure your equipment. Why not insure your crop inputs? Nano Yield is a family-owned company, and their products are all proudly made right here in the United States of America. You can learn more at Nano Yield's website. That's nano, N-A-N-O-yield, nano-yield.com. Check out their grower testimonials on YouTube. While you're on YouTube, please go and subscribe to my channel. It doesn't cost anything. I've been really pushing my YouTube the last year, and it's worked. I've got about 13,000 subscribers right now. I only had like 1,800 a year ago. So thank you very much. Go check it out. Go to YouTube and just hit subscribe on Damian Mason channel. Collectivization. You're saying, what do you mean? What the hell are you talking about? So I'm just giving you my thoughts on what actually might be threats to the supply of our productive, of our ability to make more and more food crops. Of course, there's the economics of it, right? And I talked about weather. The economics have always been there. Actually, they only get screwed up with, again, regulation and policy. All the threats to supply tend to be of a political or geopolitical nature. The regulation in Europe I just have cited, taking away some of the tools from us. In my book, Food Fear, which is right over my shoulder right here, I talked about DDT. DDT was an amazing insecticide. We've saved millions and millions of lives in the third world developing countries that humans would die of malaria and dengue and other insect-based diseases. We used DDT probably way too much. It was cheap, it was effective, it was very affordable, right? Very effective and affordable, works pretty easily. By God, it's going to get used. DDT and glyphosate could be a similar comparison. So regulation took DDT away, and you're saying, Damian, are you actually defending DDT? I'm just telling you, it was a product that was an amazing insecticide that actually saved a whole bunch of lives in developing countries. We didn't need it so much here in the United States because we had other products to turn to, and we also aren't a tropical country where we've got all these insect-borne diseases. But regulation took away DDT. Regulation takes away stuff from us. Regulation sometimes feels good. And if you go to the ballot box, look again, Proposition 8 and Proposition 12 that have happened in California, regulating the size of a chicken pen. What usually happens? Prices go up a little bit. Farmers make less money. And then eventually we adjust and adapt. So does it have an impact on us? We usually make the adaptation, but eventually it may not be something we can adapt to. You need to not have pigs in pens at all. Well, what the hell are we supposed to do? I mean, wander around with them and, like a dog on a leash. So regulation is obviously a concern. And I talked about confrontation at a global level, and I talked about weaponization. That's the one that I see actually as a subcategory of confrontation, where if you are out militaried and you're out economic, you've got to fight dirty, right? Remember my thing about fighting with a meth head? Well, if you've got to fight the United States, or you want to cause harm to the United States because somehow our harm is their gain, you'd go after our food supply. And I could see that being an issue where there's, weaponization could be trying to contaminate the food. It could be doing what you can to harm our productive capacity through processing. Energy blackouts that make it so that somehow the flow of energy is not going to where our meat processing happens. I mean, there's a lot of different things here. Disease, of course, introduction of disease is the big one. So let's talk about collectivization. And I see this as another Asian that could be a threat to our food supply. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about, and again, I said most of our threats tend to be a geopolitical or even a political thing, or, I talked about Humane Society of the United States going to California, running ads to then get the voters to show up that then create regulations on how you raise your chickens. So let's talk about the other movement that has me a little concerned. Collectivism, I should say. And I talked about this in my book also. If you like history, great, you already know this. If you don't like history, you've never studied this, then just bear with me for a minute. Collectivism means pushing for a more socialized economy. Or maybe the government owns the means of production. Russia, after the Bolshevik Revolution, collectivized the farming. In fact, created propaganda and told the citizenry that the reason they were poor, and there was by the way, a very two-tiered class over there. The rulers live pretty well. That's how usually these systems work. And the peasants starve. And tell the peasants the reason they're starving is because these rich farmers. And so then you take over the farms using government force, and all of a sudden now everybody owns the farms. But there's a problem with that. And this actually is undefeated in the history of the world. Anytime that agriculture was collectivized, there's been the same result. It is undefeated. It is 100% of the time. Starvation and food insecurity is a result of collectivizing farming in whatever country you're talking about. I can go with Russia. I can go with Venezuela. I can go with Cuba. You name the communist country where we collectivized production agriculture. So all of a sudden you've got the guy out here that says, oh, well, I'm just supposed to show up and work on this collective farm, but I don't get anything out of it. So next thing you know, the Russian farmhand is drinking vodka all day because what the hell difference does it make whether he grows potatoes well or grows potatoes poorly? He doesn't make any more money. This is not a pro-capitalism economic statement here. It's reality. Why am I saying this could be a threat? Let me just give you some thoughts here. In the United States of America, we are dependent on government policy for our agricultural system, like it or don't. 23% of farm income last year was derived from the taxpayers. In other words, almost 1/4 of what farmers made in 2025 was because of payments from the government, taxpayer money. Okay. So let's just say that this taxpayer money starts coming with more and more strings. Or more importantly, let's just say that the folks that are making these payments decide they don't want to do this anymore. And let's just say that there's maybe a movement politically at the top. Let's call it the Mamdani effect. What am I talking about? The mayor of New York City, the largest city in our country, is an avowed social democrat, which really most of his stuff it comes straight out of the Marx doctrine, and it is very verging on communistic. This is not making a political judgment here. It's pretty obvious. If you know your history, you can look at this. And he spoke at his inaugural and said that he wanted to replace rugged individualism with the warmth of collectivism. Do you hear what I just said? So what about the warmth of collectivism that comes to agriculture? What if we actually see a turn over the next few years, maybe decade? Folks like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are being touted as a presidential candidate. Mamdani is the mayor of the biggest city in the United States of America. And you might be saying, Damian, those people won't ever get voted in out here in Nebraska. You're right. They don't have to. Remember that thing I told you about population? You're completely outnumbered. If you're in a red area, you're probably completely outnumbered. And if you're in agriculture, you're probably outnumbered. The point is, these folks who already talk about the evils of cow farts, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who talks about how the rich are taking advantage of the poor, and who flew around on a private plane with Bernie Sanders touting all sorts of very hard left socialistic statements, has some opinions about agriculture. She thinks you eat too many cheeseburgers. She thinks the weather is altered by you eating cheeseburgers. Mamdani talks about the warmth of collectivism. Why would that not something that should be a possible threat to production agriculture? Where am I going? Well, let's just think about this. Look at the assets you hold. Trillions of dollars. I've read the number and I've actually forgotten it. Quite a bit, a significant amount. I believe it was a couple $1 trillion of agricultural real estate is the number, meaning that you hold, and me, farm owners, people like you and me. So look at a candidate that gets tremendous amount of support from the younger crowd that has believed that capitalism has failed them, and then looks at the agriculture and says, you know what, RFK Jr. told me that our factory farms are poisoning us, and Mamdani says that collectivism is warm and rugged individualism is cold. So you know what we need to do? We need to have the government take over these farms. We need to have the government in charge of this, because the government would do a better job than all these rich farmers. You're saying, Damian, this isn't even accurate. I'm telling you, you've already got a government policy that props up the existing system, and you've got an undercurrent of angst and unhappiness. Do I see this as a viable threat? I'd put it at 20%. I'd put it at 20 to 30%. I'm looking down the road. And remember, I've got a long, long history. I was a political comedy guy back in a long time. I read what these politicians say, and I look at the following or the propaganda they have. And I could see this being something that's touted. Agriculture as it is right now is giving you diabetes and obesity, and they're using all those chemicals out there on those factory farms. You know what? We need a complete wholesale change to this. Let's replace this agricultural system we have with the warmth of collectivism. So I think collectivization is an absolute threat, and people are going to think I'm crazy. I don't mind. Remember, it's like I tell my live audiences, I'm not saying this is going to happen tomorrow. I'm offering the idea that this is a possible threat to our food supply. And the more you look at some of what's on the bench for politicians that get a tremendous amount of coverage and also have a tremendous amount of, shall we say, following, who are young and coming up on this whole front, it would not hurt them one bit. You will not lose one vote by saying you want to collectivize Nebraska, because you weren't going to get that vote anyhow. This could be a real thing. What do I see as threats to the productive capacity of American agriculture? I've laid it out there. I think it's confrontation, as in war. I think it's escalation of weaponization, meaning we start using food as a weapon, which has always happened, but now I'm talking about the ability to produce it. What about then regulation? I gave the European Union as a great example. I think we can look at some issues in Canada, and I think our risk factors here are going to be on the water and on nutrient usage right there, which means we're going to have to get a lot more lean and use less stuff, and to avoid what regulation is going to do to us. And we're going to have to smarten up also on our utilization of water, because I think water is a huge issue moving forward. We're talking about whether the climate is changing. Everything in the West is getting drier. So this is going to be a big thing, and we'll get regulated on nutrients and on water, and I see it coming fast. Then, of course, collectivization. I do not see that coming fast, but I see calls for it. Again, read the tea leaves. Watch what's going on. Hear what is being said at the rallies, and look at where the groundswell is. Did you ever think that we would talk about government-run grocery stores? That's what's being pitched in New York City right now. The grocery business operates on about 2 to 3% profit margins as is. So I don't know how the government is going to be better at delivering groceries than Walmart in terms of efficiency, but it doesn't matter. It sounds good, and it plays well with the audience, just like collectivization of production agriculture might also. These are all things that I'm putting out there for make you think. And that's what I'm here for. You know, we've been doing this for almost 9 years. I'm in my ninth year now of producing the Business of Agriculture. It's available wherever you get your audio, so go ahead and get it. We're in the top 1% to 2% of audio podcasts globally. I thank you for doing that in terms of listens. Yes, we're doing very, very well on our listens, and we're also doing very well over on YouTube. So please do hit subscribe. Share this with somebody that can benefit from it. Also, remember my sponsors. They make this all possible, and I appreciate you. I appreciate them. And I would also appreciate your thoughts on this very topic. What do you think the threats are? And by the way, I'm going to throw it out there. The big threat that a lot of people have been telling me is we're not going to have anybody that's going to farm in the future. And I just don't see that being the case because it hasn't been forever. We got fewer farms being run by fewer people, but the productive capacity on a per acre using technology, and we start rolling in all of the available technology, I do not see that being a threat. So the threats that I did just dismiss were, I don't see the weather being a big threat. I don't see a threat of climate change. I don't see a threat of nobody wanting to do the farming. In fact, I think that there's so many people that love this idea and want to do this. I don't see that being an issue. I don't see, you could say corporatization being a threat to food supply because we're going to be too corporate. I don't see that being an issue either. The only issue would be, like I said, I think on a regulatory front. And then you got to wonder who can push some of this regulation. You know, sometimes there are benefits. If you push regulation that decreases supply, you might profit from it. Because remember, when things are in surplus, it's hard to make money. When things are in scarcity, any good, from bicycles to soybeans, when the product is in scarcity, there is profit incentive. And that's the other risk with regulation. Because remember, behind every regulation, there's probably some corporation or some industry that actually benefits by said regulation that might be pushing it. Regulation, confrontation, weaponization, and collectivization. Those are the threats as I see them. But do comment and tell me what you think the threats are, especially here in North America. Damian Mason, so much thanks to all of you for being here. This is the Business of Agriculture. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Business of Agriculture, brought to you by my friends at AgView Solutions. I told you up front about AgView Solutions. They're an advisory group for agriculture professionals that can help you in your agricultural business and your farming operation. Maybe it's transition planning, analyzing your cost of production, strategic growth initiatives, discovering business opportunities and ferreting them out, overall improvements to your farm and your agricultural business. That's what they do as advisors. The team at AgView Solutions is comprised of consultants who also farm and run multiple businesses. They get it. You can check out their services at agviewsolutions.com. They help farming operations in 25 states as well as Canada. agviewsolutions.com. Check it out.